The people sitting in the front row had no idea they were about to witness the collapse of a lie that had survived for 7 years. The Grand Ballroom in Washington, D.C. glowed beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered warm light across polished marble floors and rows of elegantly dressed guests. Senators, governors, military leaders, business executives, educators, and journalists filled the room with a low murmur of anticipation. Cameras stood ready near the stage. Servers moved quietly between tables carrying glasses that reflected the golden light overhead. It was the kind of evening where history occasionally stepped into the room without warning. Daniel Brooks adjusted the cuff of his tailored black suit and glanced toward the stage. He looked exactly like a man who belonged there. Successful, confident, respected. His company had grown steadily over the years, and invitations to events like this had become routine. Recognition ceremonies, charity galas, leadership conferences. They all blended together now. Tonight felt no different. At least, not yet. He leaned back comfortably in his chair and checked the printed program resting beside his plate. The event honored Americans who had made extraordinary contributions to communities across the nation. The names of several recipients had been kept confidential until the official presentation. Daniel did not think much about it. His attention drifted toward the conversations around him. Nearby, guests discussed economic policy, education initiatives, and charitable foundations. Across the room, television crews adjusted equipment beneath soft studio lights. Everything felt polished and predictable. Then his gaze paused on a name listed among the evening's special guests. Emily Carter. For a moment, he wondered if it was merely a coincidence. Emily Carter was not exactly a rare name. Still, something about seeing those two words together caused a faint smile to appear. 7 years had passed since the divorce. 7 years since he had watched his former wife disappear from the social circles they once shared. He rarely thought about her anymore. When people occasionally asked what happened to his ex-wife, he usually answered with a shrug and a quiet laugh. She never really became anything. The sentence had become so familiar that he no longer questioned it. Others accepted it without hesitation. Why would they not? Emily vanished. Daniel stayed visible. Visibility often wins arguments before facts ever arrive. A voice from the stage interrupted his thoughts. The evening ceremony was beginning. The audience settled into silence as a master of ceremonies welcomed everyone and spoke about service, leadership, and dedication. Applause followed. More introductions came. More speeches. Daniel listened politely while occasionally checking his watch. The event moved smoothly, but his attention wandered. Then something unexpected happened. A large screen behind the stage illuminated with a montage of photographs. Small towns, community centers, school buildings, flood recovery projects, scholarship programs, volunteers carrying supplies, families embracing one another. The images moved quickly, accompanied by soft orchestral music. Daniel watched casually at first. Then he noticed a woman appearing repeatedly throughout the photographs, standing beside teachers, listening to veterans, helping children plant trees, speaking with families. The images changed too quickly to be certain, but something about her felt strangely familiar. He frowned slightly. The screen shifted again. More photographs appeared. More communities. More projects. More lives changed. The same woman remained present throughout nearly every image. The audience watched quietly. Several guests nodded with recognition, as though they already knew the story being told. Daniel sat forward slightly in his chair. The woman on the screen never seemed interested in cameras. She was usually standing behind someone else, listening instead of speaking, working instead of posing. Yet somehow she became impossible to ignore. The music softened. The images faded. The ballroom grew still. Then the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. Some individuals change lives without asking for recognition, he said. Some spend years building opportunities for others while remaining largely invisible themselves. A respectful silence settled across the room. Tonight, we honor one such person. Daniel felt a strange sensation he could not explain. His attention sharpened. The presenter continued speaking about service programs spanning multiple states, educational initiatives, community partnerships, disaster recovery efforts, millions of dollars directed toward underserved communities, tens of thousands of lives impacted. The accomplishments sounded almost unbelievable. Daniel glanced around the room. Every face seemed focused on the stage. Every eye waited for the same answer. Who had done all of this? The presenter smiled gently. In a moment, the President of the United States will present our highest civilian community leadership award. Applause echoed through the ballroom. Daniel joined politely. Then the presenter looked toward the audience and spoke the next sentence. Before we welcome our recipient, let us remember that true success is often invisible until the day the world finally notices. For reasons he could not explain, those words settled heavily in Daniel's chest. Somewhere beyond the bright stage lights, beyond the applause, beyond the expectations of the evening, a truth was already moving quietly toward him. He simply did not know it yet. Daniel Brooks sat motionless as applause rolled politely through the ballroom. The presenter stepped away from the podium while another video began playing across the enormous screens behind the stage. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. The audience watched in respectful silence. Daniel told himself he was overthinking things. The woman appearing throughout the photographs could not possibly be Emily. The idea felt ridiculous. His former wife had never sought attention. She had never enjoyed public recognition. More importantly, she had disappeared. At least that was the version of the story he had repeated for years. He shifted slightly in his chair and forced himself to focus on the presentation. The screen displayed a small rural town surrounded by rolling farmland. Children poured out of a renovated school building carrying backpacks and smiling at volunteers gathered outside. The narration explained that educational programs had transformed opportunities for thousands of students in underserved communities. The images changed. A coastal town recovering from a devastating storm appeared next. Volunteers distributed supplies. Families stood beside newly restored homes. Then another community appeared. And another. Different states. Different challenges. Different people. Yet one detail remained constant. The same woman continued appearing quietly in the background. Never at the center. Never seeking attention. Listening to local leaders. Sitting with families. Walking through schools. Reviewing plans. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Something about her posture felt familiar. The way she tilted her head while listening. The way she folded her hands while standing. Small details that seemed impossible to forget once noticed. The narration continued. For more than 6 years, this leader has invested time, resources, and personal commitment into communities that many people overlooked. More photographs filled the screen. Daniel felt an unexpected tension settling into his shoulders. Around him, guests appeared increasingly engaged. Some nodded as though they already knew the story. Others exchanged impressed glances. Several military veterans seated near the front row watched with visible emotion. Whatever organization stood behind these efforts had clearly changed lives. Daniel could not deny that. But a strange feeling continued growing inside him. He remembered the last conversation he ever had with Emily. 7 years earlier, she stood in the kitchen of the house they once shared. Evening sunlight filtered through the windows while unopened moving boxes lined the walls. She had spoken quietly about wanting a life that meant something beyond status and appearances. Daniel remembered laughing. Not cruelly, not intentionally, but enough to make her fall silent. At the time, her ideas sounded unrealistic, idealistic, detached from reality. Success, he believed, belonged to people who chased it aggressively. Emily seemed interested in helping people nobody else noticed. He considered that admirable but impractical. Looking back now, he could not remember exactly what words were exchanged that night. He only remembered the expression on her face. Disappointed, but not surprised. The video continued. The audience watched as scholarship recipients graduated from college. Small business owners reopened storefronts. Community centers welcomed families through newly restored doors. The accomplishments seemed almost endless. Daniel glanced toward the printed program again. There was still no mention of the recipient's name. Only descriptions, contributions, achievements. Every detail deepened the mystery. Then the screen displayed a close-up image of a weathered notebook resting on a wooden desk. Handwritten plans covered the pages. Budget figures, community goals, lists of names. The narrator explained that the recipient personally reviewed nearly every project proposal during the organization's early years. Daniel felt his pulse quicken slightly. Emily used to keep notebooks exactly like that. Spiral-bound, filled with detailed plans and impossible ideas. She carried them everywhere. He remembered finding them scattered across kitchen tables and coffee shop counters. He used to joke that she spent more time planning than living. A few guests laughed softly as the video showed old photographs of volunteers working from folding tables inside cramped community centers. Humble beginnings, limited resources, determined people. The audience seemed charmed by the story. Daniel no longer felt amused. The similarities were becoming difficult to ignore. Beside him, a woman from a national nonprofit organization smiled warmly. An incredible story, isn't it? Daniel nodded automatically. It really is. She glanced toward the stage. I met the recipient 3 years ago. One of the most remarkable people I have ever encountered. Daniel swallowed. You know who it is? The woman smiled. Many of us do. Her expression softened. Trust me, the recognition is long overdue. Before Daniel could ask another question, the lights dimmed slightly. The video came to an end. The final image remained on the giant screen. It showed a woman standing with a group of children beneath an American flag outside a newly built community center. The photograph was taken from a distance. Her face was partially turned away. Yet this time Daniel recognized her immediately. His breath caught. The room seemed strangely quiet. The shape of her profile, the color of her hair, the familiar posture. It was Emily. Not a woman who resembled Emily. Not someone with similar features. Emily Carter, his former wife. The woman he had spent 7 years describing as a failure. The applause began again, louder than before. But Daniel barely heard it. Because for the first time that evening, he realized the truth was no longer approaching. It had already entered the room. Daniel Brooks could not look away from the giant screen. The photograph remained visible for only a few seconds before fading into darkness, but it was enough. There was no doubt anymore. The woman standing among those children was Emily Carter. His Emily. Or rather, the woman who had once been his wife before life carried them in different directions. The ballroom seemed smaller now. The elegant room that had felt comfortable and familiar only minutes earlier suddenly felt filled with invisible eyes. Not because anyone was looking at him. Nobody was. That was the strange part. The entire evening had never been about him. Yet for the first time in years, he felt exposed. The applause gradually faded. The presenter returned to center stage while guests settled back into their seats. Daniel remained motionless. Around him, people smiled and exchanged quiet comments about the remarkable accomplishments they had just witnessed. Several guests appeared emotional. One woman dabbed at the corner of her eye with a napkin. A retired military officer sitting nearby nodded slowly, as though remembering something important. The room carried the atmosphere of respect reserved for individuals who had genuinely changed lives. Daniel swallowed hard. His mind drifted backward through the years. He remembered the first few months after the divorce. Friends would occasionally ask what happened to Emily. At first he answered honestly enough. She moved away. She wanted something different. She was focusing on other priorities. But as time passed, the answers became shorter. Easier. More dismissive. Somewhere along the way, the story changed. Maybe because it protected his pride. Maybe because it simplified an uncomfortable truth. Whenever someone mentioned Emily, he would smile politely and say she never really accomplished much after the divorce. The statement spread naturally. People repeated it because it came from him. He was visible, successful, connected. Nobody questioned the narrative. Why would they? Emily was nowhere to be seen. The silence around her became evidence supporting a conclusion that was never true. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Quite a story, isn't it? It was the woman seated beside him from the nonprofit organization. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. She smiled toward the stage. I first met her in Kentucky. Daniel turned slightly. You know her? The woman laughed gently. A lot of people do. There was warmth in her voice. Genuine affection. She helped rebuild 3 community centers after severe flooding. Most people never knew she was involved. Daniel stared at her. The woman continued. That is how she always works. Quietly. Quietly. The word lingered. Emily had always been quiet. Not weak. Not passive. Just uninterested in competing for attention. During their marriage, Daniel often interpreted that quality as a lack of ambition. Looking back now, he wondered how many times he had confused humility with failure. The lights dimmed slightly again. A new speaker approached the podium and began describing the recipient's journey. The story unfolded piece by piece. Small projects became larger initiatives. Local programs expanded into regional networks. Thousands of volunteers joined the mission over time. Millions of dollars were directed toward education, housing, disaster recovery, and community development. Yet the most striking detail was not the scale. It was the consistency. Year after year, project after project, community after community. The work never stopped. Daniel found himself searching the room. If Emily was here, where was she sitting? The guest tables stretched across the ballroom beneath golden light. Politicians, military leaders, business executives, philanthropists, hundreds of faces. Then he saw her, 3 tables closer to the stage. Emily sat quietly beside several community leaders. No entourage, no spotlight, no attempt to draw attention to herself. Her blonde hair rested neatly on her shoulders. She wore a simple dark blue dress that looked elegant without being extravagant. While others watched the stage, she seemed focused on listening to the people around her. One elderly woman beside her spoke animatedly. Emily smiled and listened with complete attention. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. 7 years. 7 years of assumptions. 7 years of stories. 7 years of believing visibility and importance were the same thing. Yet the woman sitting across the ballroom looked exactly like the person he remembered. Calm, thoughtful, comfortable, allowing others to shine. The irony struck him with painful clarity. Everything he once criticized about Emily now appeared connected to the very reason she was being honored. The audience erupted into applause again. This time the sound seemed louder, more emotional. The presenter stepped back from the microphone and looked toward the front row where several distinguished guests waited. Then came the announcement everyone had anticipated throughout the evening. The President of the United States would arrive on stage within moments to present the award. The room rose to its feet. Cameras shifted position. Security personnel moved discreetly along the edges of the ballroom. Excitement filled the air. Daniel stood with everyone else. But while the crowd looked toward the stage, his eyes remained fixed on Emily. Because somewhere between the fading lies of the past and the truth unfolding before him, he had begun to realize that the woman he once described as a failure had been quietly building a legacy while nobody was watching. The entire ballroom remained standing as the president entered beneath a wave of respectful applause. Camera flashes sparkled across the room like distant stars. The atmosphere carried a rare kind of energy, the feeling that everyone present understood they were witnessing something larger than an ordinary awards ceremony. Daniel Brooks applauded with the crowd, but his attention never left Emily. She still sat calmly at her table. While others looked toward the stage, she seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention gathering around her. It was a familiar expression. During their marriage, she had always preferred conversations over recognition, people over publicity. Daniel used to view that quality as a weakness. Now he was beginning to wonder if he had misunderstood her all along. The president greeted several dignitaries before approaching the podium. The room gradually settled into silence. Only the faint hum of television equipment and the distant click of camera shutters could be heard. Then the speech began. The president spoke about service, about leadership, about the people who quietly strengthen communities without expecting rewards. Every sentence seemed to build toward a larger story. Daniel listened carefully. He noticed something unusual. The accomplishments being described were not connected to a single dramatic event. There was no breakthrough invention, no viral campaign, no famous public movement. Instead, there were years of consistent effort. One school renovated, one scholarship funded, one struggling family helped, one forgotten town supported, then another, and another. The work stretched across years and across state lines. It was the kind of impact that rarely made headlines because it happened slowly. Yet the cumulative effect was extraordinary. Images returned to the giant screens. This time they remained longer. Daniel saw Emily standing beside a teacher inside a small classroom. Another photograph showed her helping organize supplies after a natural disaster. Another captured her listening to a veteran seated on a folding chair outside a community center. She never stood in the middle of the frame, never appeared to command attention. Yet every image carried the same unmistakable quality. People trusted her. The president continued speaking. Our recipient demonstrated something increasingly rare: the willingness to invest years of effort into problems that offered little visibility and no guarantee of recognition. Several audience members nodded. Daniel noticed community. Leaders at Emily's table exchanging proud smiles. They were not impressed by her success. They seemed grateful for her presence. That realization unsettled him even more. Throughout his own career, success had often been measured through numbers: revenue, growth, market share, recognition. Emily appeared to have measured success differently. The president described scholarship programs that helped first-generation college students, community initiatives that revitalized struggling neighborhoods, emergency assistance projects that reached families during difficult times. Each accomplishment was supported by names, dates, and measurable results. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing sounded theatrical. The facts alone were powerful enough. Daniel remembered countless conversations from years earlier. Emily often spoke about helping people who lacked opportunities. He remembered dismissing those ideas as unrealistic. Noble perhaps, but impractical. Listening now, he realized she had spent years turning those ideas into reality, while he continued believing she had accomplished nothing. The contradiction was difficult to process. Then came a moment that changed the atmosphere entirely. The president paused and smiled. What makes this story remarkable is not simply what was achieved. It is how it was achieved. The room grew even quieter. For years, this individual declined opportunities for publicity. She redirected attention toward volunteers, educators, community leaders, and families. Again and again, she chose service over recognition. Daniel felt the words land heavily inside him. Around the ballroom, guests listened with admiration. Many were hearing the full story for the first time. Yet Daniel carried an additional burden. He knew how many times he had spoken carelessly about Emily. How many people had accepted his version of events. How many conversations had ended with the assumption that she had faded into irrelevance. Meanwhile, she had been building something far greater than anyone imagined. The president glanced toward Emily's table. Cameras immediately shifted in her direction. For the first time all evening, she appeared slightly overwhelmed. She lowered her eyes briefly and smiled modestly while applause began spreading through the room once more. Daniel watched her carefully. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at being proven right, only humility, only gratitude. The applause continued, growing louder. Then the president spoke the words everyone had been waiting to hear. Please join me in recognizing a woman whose quiet dedication has transformed countless lives across our nation. Emily Carter. The ballroom erupted. Hundreds of people rose to their feet again. The sound filled every corner of the room. Daniel remained standing among them, watching as Emily slowly rose from her chair. And in that moment, as the entire nation seemed ready to celebrate the woman he once failed to understand, Daniel realized the story he had told about her for 7 years was finally beginning to disappear beneath the weight of the truth. Emily Carter stood slowly as the applause continued washing across the ballroom like a rising tide. For a brief moment, she seemed almost surprised by the intensity of the reaction around her. Community leaders reached for her hands. Educators embraced her. Veterans seated nearby nodded with deep respect. The people closest to her did not appear impressed by the award itself. Their expressions carried something more meaningful: gratitude. Daniel Brooks watched every second. The distance between their tables was less than 40 feet, yet it felt like an entire lifetime separated them. Emily smoothed a small fold in her dress and offered a modest smile before beginning the walk toward the stage. The giant screens followed her movement through the ballroom. Camera operators stepped carefully backward to capture the moment. The audience remained standing. Some guests applauded enthusiastically. Others simply watched with admiration. Daniel noticed something remarkable. Emily never appeared to enjoy being the center of attention. Even now, while hundreds of influential people celebrated her accomplishments, she seemed more comfortable acknowledging others than accepting recognition for herself. As she moved through the aisle, several attendees reached out to shake her hand. A former governor thanked her quietly. A military officer placed a hand over his heart. A school superintendent smiled through tears. These were not ceremonial gestures. They were deeply personal reactions from people whose lives had been touched by her work. Daniel felt an uncomfortable pressure building inside his chest. For years, he had measured success through visibility. Emily had apparently measured it through impact. The difference suddenly seemed enormous. When she finally reached the stage, the president greeted her warmly. They exchanged a few private words that microphones did not capture. Emily smiled softly and nodded. Then she accepted the award with both hands. The audience responded with another wave of applause. Bright lights reflected from the polished surface of the medal. Yet Daniel noticed that Emily's attention seemed fixed not on the award, but on the people seated throughout the ballroom. Her eyes moved across the audience as though searching for familiar faces. Volunteers, teachers, community organizers, families, the individuals who had built the mission alongside her. The president returned to the podium and spoke briefly about leadership through service. Then came the moment everyone anticipated. Emily stepped forward to deliver her remarks. The room fell completely silent. Daniel expected a powerful speech, a dramatic story, perhaps even a carefully prepared message designed to inspire. Instead, Emily stood quietly for several seconds before speaking. Her voice was calm and steady. "I am deeply honored to accept this recognition." She paused. "But the truth is that every project represented here tonight was built by people who rarely receive recognition themselves." The audience listened closely. Emily spoke about teachers who stayed late to help struggling students, volunteers who worked weekends rebuilding damaged neighborhoods, veterans who mentored young people after returning home, local leaders who refused to abandon their communities during difficult times. With every example, she shifted attention away from herself and toward others. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Nothing about her speech sounded rehearsed. Nothing sounded designed to impress. She simply spoke from experience. She described visiting small towns where people solved problems together despite limited resources. She spoke about hope appearing in unexpected places. She spoke about resilience, kindness, and the quiet determination that exists in ordinary people. Several guests wiped away tears. Others nodded thoughtfully. The ballroom seemed united by something larger than politics, business, or status. Emily continued, "The strongest communities are not built by famous people. They are built by neighbors who decide not to give up on one another." Applause interrupted her words. She waited patiently before continuing. Daniel listened in complete silence. Every sentence revealed a version of Emily he should have recognized long ago. The values she spoke about were not new. She believed in them during their marriage. She talked about them in countless conversations. The difference was that she had spent 7 years turning those beliefs into reality, while he remained trapped inside assumptions about what mattered most. When Emily finished speaking, the audience rose once again. The standing ovation lasted longer than any applause that evening. She accepted it with visible humility before stepping away from the microphone. As she returned toward her table, people continued reaching out to congratulate her. Yet Emily responded to every compliment in the same way. She redirected praise toward someone else. A volunteer, a teacher, a partner organization, a community leader. Watching her, Daniel finally understood why the room respected her so deeply. It was not because she held an award. It was because she had spent years helping other people carry their burdens without asking for attention in return. And as the applause echoed through the ballroom once more, Daniel began confronting a difficult truth. Emily had never changed into someone extraordinary. She had always been this person. He had simply failed to see her clearly. The ceremony continued long after Emily returned to her table, but for Daniel Brooks, time seemed to move differently now. Conversations resumed throughout the ballroom. Guests exchanged observations about the evening. Reporters quietly prepared for interviews. Camera crews adjusted equipment for the closing segments of the broadcast. Yet Daniel remained seated, staring at the empty stage where only minutes earlier the entire room had celebrated the woman he once believed had disappeared from relevance. The realization refused to leave him. Emily had not disappeared. She had simply chosen a path that unfolded beyond the places he spent his time looking. A server passed by carrying a tray of coffee. Daniel accepted a cup without thinking. The warmth settled into his hands while his thoughts drifted backward through the years. He remembered the final months of their marriage with surprising clarity. Emily often spent evenings researching nonprofit programs, educational initiatives, and community development projects. He remembered stacks of articles spread across the dining room table. He remembered conversations about underserved towns and struggling schools. At the time, he viewed those interests as hobbies rather than ambitions. Serious people built companies. Serious people chased measurable success. Serious people focused on growth and influence. That had always been his definition. Tonight, that definition felt painfully incomplete. Across the ballroom, Emily sat with a group of educators and community leaders. Several people approached their table to congratulate her. She greeted each person with the same genuine warmth. There was no performance in her behavior. No sudden transformation brought on by recognition. She looked exactly like the woman he had known years ago. The difference was not Emily. The difference was what he had failed to notice. An elderly man seated beside her leaned forward while speaking. Emily listened carefully. A young teacher joined the conversation. Emily listened again. Daniel noticed a pattern. She gave people her full attention. Not because cameras were present. Not because influential guests surrounded her. She simply valued people. The observation triggered another memory. Years earlier, Emily once spent an entire afternoon helping a neighbor whose husband had become seriously ill. Daniel remembered being frustrated because they missed a social event afterward. Emily never complained. She simply said that some things mattered more than schedules. At the time, he considered her priorities misplaced. Looking around the ballroom now, he wondered how many moments like that he had misunderstood. The evening shifted into a reception following the formal presentations. Guests began moving between tables. Small groups formed throughout the room. Conversations filled the air. Daniel remained where he was, uncertain what to do next. Part of him wanted to leave quietly. Another part felt compelled to stay. Eventually, he stood and moved toward one of the display areas near the edge of the ballroom. Large panels showcased photographs from community projects featured during the ceremony. School renovations, scholarship recipients, disaster recovery efforts, family resource centers. Daniel studied each image carefully. Emily appeared in many of them, though rarely at the center. She was helping unload supplies, reviewing plans with local leaders, sitting beside students, listening to families. The photographs covered nearly 7 years. 7 years. The same period during which he had been telling people she accomplished nothing. A voice nearby interrupted his thoughts. She never wanted any of this attention. Daniel turned and found himself standing beside a middle-aged woman wearing an event credential. She smiled at one of the photographs. The recognition, I mean. Daniel glanced back toward the image. You know her well? The woman nodded. I have worked with her for almost 5 years. Pride filled her voice. Emily always says the mission matters more than the spotlight. Daniel looked at the photograph again. Has she always been like that? The woman laughed softly. Always. The answer arrived without hesitation. Always. Not recently. Not after success arrived. Always. Daniel thanked her and stepped away. The ballroom lights seemed warmer now. The conversations around him felt more distant. He found himself looking toward Emily once again. She was smiling at something a volunteer had said. Nothing about her suggested resentment. Nothing suggested a desire to prove anyone wrong. She appeared completely at peace. And perhaps that was the hardest part for Daniel to understand. If their positions had been reversed, he was not sure he would have handled the moment with such grace. Yet Emily carried herself exactly as she always had. Quiet, steady, grounded. While the evening continued around him, Daniel began recognizing a truth he could no longer avoid. The story he told other people about Emily had never really been about her. It had been about his inability to recognize value when it arrived in forms he did not understand. And for the first time since walking into the ballroom, he started wondering what else he might have been wrong about. The reception gradually settled into a slower rhythm as the evening moved forward. Conversations became smaller and more personal. Television crews packed away some of their equipment. Guests who had arrived as strangers now stood together sharing stories beneath the warm glow of chandeliers. Outside the tall windows of the ballroom, the lights of Washington, D.C. shimmered against the dark sky. Inside, Daniel Brooks found himself standing alone near one of the marble columns, watching a world he suddenly realized he did not fully understand. Across the room, Emily remained surrounded by people, yet she never appeared trapped by the attention. She moved naturally from one conversation to another, speaking with volunteers, educators, veterans, and community leaders. No matter who approached her, she offered the same level of respect. Daniel noticed that nobody seemed interested in discussing the award itself. Instead, people shared stories. A school principal described students whose lives changed because of scholarship programs. A veteran spoke about finding purpose through community initiatives. A mother talked about resources that helped her family during a difficult period. Again and again, Emily listened. She smiled. She asked questions. She remembered details. The award had brought everyone into the room, but the real reason people admired her was becoming increasingly clear. She made people feel seen. Daniel stared into his untouched coffee and remembered another evening many years ago. He and Emily had attended a fundraising dinner during their marriage. Most guests spent the night networking with influential donors. Emily spent nearly an hour speaking with a volunteer coordinator whom nobody else seemed to notice. Daniel remembered teasing her afterward. He asked why she spent so much time talking to someone who could not advance her career. Emily had simply smiled and replied, "Because she matters." At the time, he considered the answer naive. Standing in this ballroom years later, he felt a quiet embarrassment settle over him. How many lessons had he ignored because they arrived in simple forms? A burst of laughter pulled him back to the present. Nearby, a group of community leaders gathered around Emily. One elderly man stood holding a cane while telling a story. The entire group listened closely. When he finished, Emily laughed along with everyone else. The moment looked effortless, genuine, human. Daniel suddenly understood why photographs from the presentation carried such warmth. Emily was not visiting communities as an outsider. She belonged within them. A younger man approached Daniel and extended his hand. "Daniel Brooks, right?" Daniel shook it politely. The man introduced himself as the director of a regional education partnership. After a few moments of conversation, the man glanced toward Emily. His expression immediately softened. "She changed our future." Daniel looked in the same direction. "How?" The man smiled. 5 years ago, our district was losing teachers faster than we could replace them. Funding was disappearing. Student performance was declining. Most people assumed the community would continue falling behind. He paused. Emily never accepted that. Daniel listened carefully. The man described years of support, mentorship programs, scholarship initiatives, and educational investments. None of it sounded glamorous. None of it generated headlines. Yet together, the efforts transformed an entire region. She never asked for recognition, the man said. In fact, she usually avoided it. Daniel nodded slowly. That answer no longer surprised him. As the conversation ended, he remained standing in thoughtful silence. Throughout the evening, people kept sharing the same theme. Different stories, different communities, different lives, yet the same conclusion. Emily had shown up when others moved on. She stayed committed when projects became difficult. She listened when people felt ignored. Daniel realized something else. Not one person spoke about her wealth. Not one person mentioned status. Nobody seemed impressed by titles or influence. The admiration came from trust. Trust earned over years of consistent action. The distinction mattered. Across the ballroom, Emily finally stepped away from a group of well-wishers and moved toward one of the quieter corners of the room. For the first time all evening, she appeared alone. She stood near a large window overlooking the city lights below. The reflection of the room shimmered across the glass. She seemed peaceful, not triumphant, not emotional, simply peaceful. Daniel felt an unexpected urge to walk across the room and speak to her. 7 years of distance suddenly felt impossible to measure. What would he even say? Congratulations sounded insufficient. An apology felt incomplete. Every possible sentence seemed smaller than the truth he was beginning to understand. Before he could make a decision, another guest approached Emily and began speaking with her. The moment disappeared. Daniel remained where he was. Yet something had shifted inside him. Earlier that evening, he viewed Emily as a surprising success story. Now he saw something entirely different. Success was only the visible result. The real story was character. The real story was who she had chosen to become when nobody was watching. And as the reception continued beneath the golden lights of the ballroom, Daniel found himself facing a difficult realization. The greatest accomplishment being celebrated tonight was not the award resting in Emily's hands. It was the life she had quietly built while the rest of the world, including him, was busy looking somewhere else. The reception slowly approached its final hour, yet the energy inside the ballroom remained warm and alive. Conversations drifted beneath crystal chandeliers while servers cleared empty glasses and refreshed tables with quiet efficiency. Beyond the towering windows, Washington, D.C. shimmered beneath a blanket of lights. The city looked timeless from this height. Daniel Brooks stood near the edge of the room, watching guests gather around Emily Carter again and again. Each person seemed eager to share a story, a memory, A moment when her work had changed something important. Daniel noticed that none of those conversations lasted only a few seconds. Emily gave every person her full attention. She listened as though each story mattered. Perhaps that was why people trusted her. Not because she held influence. Not because she carried an award. Because she made people feel heard. Eventually, the crowd around her thinned. Several guests began departing for evening flights or early morning commitments. The atmosphere softened. Formality gave way to reflection. Daniel found himself moving closer to one of the display panels without realizing it. The photographs stretched across nearly an entire wall. Communities from different states, different seasons, different years. One image captured Emily standing beside volunteers repainting a school hallway. Another showed her carrying boxes of supplies into a community center after severe flooding. A third revealed her sitting at a folding table surrounded by local leaders studying handwritten plans. The photographs shared one unusual detail. Emily never appeared to be leading from the front. She always seemed to be working alongside everyone else. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. Those pictures never tell the whole story. Daniel turned. The speaker was an older gentleman wearing a small lapel pin from one of the nonprofit organizations featured during the ceremony. His silver hair reflected the warm ballroom lights. Daniel offered a polite smile. "You worked with her?" The man nodded. "For 6 years. He studied one of the photographs and laughed softly. That school project almost failed 3 separate times." Daniel looked surprised. The man continued. "Funding problems. Contractor delays. Bureaucratic obstacles. Most people would have walked away." His expression grew thoughtful. Emily never did. Daniel listened carefully. The man described long drives through rural communities, late-night meetings, countless setbacks, years of persistence. None of it sounded glamorous. None of it resembled the polished success stories often celebrated in business magazines. Yet somehow the story felt far more impressive. "She always believed people deserved opportunities regardless of their zip code," the man said. "Simple idea. Difficult work." Daniel nodded slowly. The phrase remained with him after the man moved on. Simple idea. Difficult work. Perhaps that described Emily better than anything else. She never chased complicated theories. She simply refused to stop helping people once she committed herself to a cause. Across the ballroom, Emily stood near the large windows overlooking the city. For the first time all evening, nobody surrounded her. She appeared content, simply watching the lights beyond the glass. Daniel hesitated. Then he took a few steps forward. Not enough to reach her. Just enough to shorten the distance. His pulse surprised him. 7 years had passed since their last meaningful conversation. 7 years of assumptions. 7 years of silence. Before he could decide whether to continue, another guest approached Emily. A young woman, perhaps 25 years old. They embraced warmly. The woman appeared emotional. Daniel watched as Emily listened carefully before offering encouragement. A few moments later, both women smiled. The younger woman wiped away tears and laughed. Whatever had been said clearly mattered. Daniel remained where he was. Something inside him resisted interrupting. Throughout the evening, he had witnessed dozens of similar moments. Teachers, veterans, volunteers, parents, students. Every interaction revealed another piece of a story he never knew existed. The greatest surprise was not Emily's accomplishments. It was her consistency. The same kindness appeared in every conversation. The same humility. The same quiet strength. Eventually, the younger woman left. Emily remained by the window. She glanced across the ballroom. For the first time that night, her eyes met Daniel's. Neither looked away immediately. There was no anger. In her expression, no triumph. No accusation. Only calm recognition. The moment lasted a few seconds before someone called her name from across the room. Emily turned and smiled politely. The connection ended. Yet something significant had happened. Daniel could not explain why. He only knew that the brief exchange carried more weight than any speech delivered during the ceremony. Because in that single moment, he understood that Emily did not need the award to prove her worth. She never had. The award simply revealed to the world what countless people had already known for years. And as the reception continued beneath the golden lights of the ballroom, Daniel began to realize that the most difficult conversation of the evening had not happened yet. It was still waiting somewhere ahead. The reception had begun to thin as the evening moved closer to its conclusion. Guests departed in small groups. their footsteps echoing softly across the marble floors. Some exchanged business cards. Others lingered near the windows for one last conversation before returning to hotels or airports. The formal excitement of the ceremony had settled into something quieter, more reflective, more human. Daniel Brooks stood near one of the ballroom entrances watching the room change around him. Earlier that evening, he had arrived expecting another networking event. Now he felt as though he had spent hours walking through pieces of a life he never knew existed. Across the ballroom, Emily Carter remained surrounded by occasional well-wishers, but the crowd had grown smaller. For the first time all night, there were moments when she stood alone between conversations. Daniel noticed something unusual. Whenever people approached her, they seemed relieved rather than intimidated. Successful individuals often carried an invisible barrier around them. Emily seemed to have the opposite effect. People moved toward her easily, as though they already knew they would be welcomed. A group of college students approached her near one of the display panels. Daniel watched from a distance. They appeared nervous at first. One young woman held a scholarship program brochure from one of Emily's organizations. Within minutes, the conversation became relaxed and full of laughter. Whatever Emily said seemed to put people at ease. The interaction reminded Daniel of something he had not thought about in years. During their marriage, neighbors often stopped by unexpectedly. Friends called her for advice. Family members trusted her with personal problems. At the time, Daniel assumed she simply had more patience than most people. Tonight he realized it was something deeper. People felt safe around her. That kind of trust could not be manufactured. It had to be earned repeatedly over time. He slowly walked toward another display area featuring photographs from various community projects. One image caught his attention immediately. It showed Emily standing beside a group of volunteers outside a small library. Snow covered the ground. Everyone wore heavy winter jackets. The photograph looked ordinary at first glance. Then Daniel noticed the date printed beneath it. The project had taken place during the same year their divorce was finalized. He stared at the image longer than intended. While he spent those months rebuilding his professional life and protecting his reputation, Emily had apparently been helping rebuild a rural library hundreds of miles away. Another photograph showed her speaking with teachers in a school cafeteria. Another revealed her helping distribute supplies after severe storms. The timeline stretched across years. Project after project. Community after community. The evidence was impossible to ignore. She had never disappeared. She had simply chosen work that rarely attracted public attention. Beautiful story, isn't it? Daniel turned toward the voice. A journalist stood nearby studying the same photographs. Daniel nodded. It really is. The journalist smiled. Most people only discovered her work recently. He gestured toward the display. But she has been doing this for years. Daniel looked back at the photographs. Why did it take so long for people to notice? The journalist laughed softly. Because she never wanted them to. The answer felt perfectly consistent with everything else he had learned tonight. The journalist continued. Every time someone tried to write a feature about her, she redirected attention to the communities instead. He shook his head with admiration. That is rare. After the journalist moved on, Daniel remained standing there in silence. The room around him blurred slightly as memories surfaced. He remembered dozens of conversations from years ago. Emily talking about service. Emily talking about impact. Emily talking about people who felt forgotten. He remembered listening without truly hearing. Not because he lacked intelligence. Not because he lacked compassion. But because he viewed the world through a different lens. Achievement meant recognition. Influence meant visibility. Importance meant being noticed. Tonight those assumptions looked painfully small. Near the center of the ballroom, Emily thanked another volunteer and began gathering a few documents from the table where she had been sitting. It appeared she was preparing to leave. The realization struck Daniel unexpectedly. The evening was ending. Soon everyone would return to their separate lives. The opportunity he had been avoiding all night would disappear. He watched as she slipped the award presentation folder into a bag and exchanged final goodbyes with several guests. She looked tired now, though not exhausted. More like someone who had spent hours giving pieces of herself to others. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. For hours he had listened to stories about Emily. He had watched her receive one of the highest honors imaginable. He had confronted years of assumptions and mistakes. Yet the one conversation that truly mattered had not happened. Not yet. Across the ballroom, Emily turned toward the exit corridor leading away from the reception hall. The crowd parted naturally as she moved forward. Daniel took a slow breath. Then, for the first time all evening, he stepped away from the safety of observation and began walking in her direction. Daniel Brooks crossed the ballroom slowly, feeling every step more heavily than the one before it. Around him, the reception continued winding toward its conclusion. Guests exchanged final handshakes. Staff members quietly organized materials from the ceremony. Conversations softened into farewells. Yet all of it seemed distant now. His attention remained fixed on Emily Carter as she approached the corridor leading away from the reception hall. 7 years separated this moment from their last meaningful conversation. 7 years of assumptions. 7 years of silence. 7 years during which he had built an entire narrative about her life without ever knowing the truth. Emily reached the corridor entrance and paused briefly while thanking one of the event organizers. The woman smiled warmly and embraced her. After another exchange of gratitude, the organizer disappeared toward the ballroom. Emily turned toward the hallway. That was when Daniel finally spoke. "Emily." His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. She stopped immediately. For a second, neither moved. Then she turned. The hallway lights reflected softly against the polished marble walls. The distant sounds of the reception lingered behind them like fading echoes. Emily looked at him calmly. There was no surprise in her expression. Perhaps she had known this conversation would eventually happen. Perhaps she had noticed him watching throughout the evening. Daniel suddenly felt unprepared. All night he had imagined what he might say. Yet now that the moment had arrived, every carefully considered sentence seemed inadequate. Emily offered a small, polite smile. "Hello, Daniel." Hearing her voice again after so many years stirred something unexpected inside him. Familiarity, regret, memory, all at once. He managed a quiet smile in return. "Hello." For a moment neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It simply carried the weight of time. Finally Daniel looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "Congratulations." Emily nodded gently. "Thank you." The simplicity of her answer somehow made the conversation harder. Daniel glanced toward the ballroom behind them. "I do not think I realized what you had been doing all these years." Emily followed his gaze for a moment before looking back at him. Most people did not. There was no bitterness in her voice. No accusation. Just a simple observation. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I thought I knew your story." Emily's expression softened slightly. "We all think we know other people's stories sometimes." The response struck him because it was true. He had spent years believing he understood exactly what happened after their divorce. Tonight had exposed how little he actually knew. A few guests passed through the corridor on their way toward the exits. The brief interruption allowed both of them a moment to gather their thoughts. When the hallway became quiet again, Daniel spoke carefully. "I owe you an apology." Emily remained silent, allowing him to continue. "For a long time, when people asked about you, I made assumptions. I repeated those assumptions." He swallowed. "Eventually I treated them like facts." Emily listened without interrupting. Daniel looked down briefly. "I was wrong." The words felt smaller than they should have. Yet they were honest. Emily stood quietly for several seconds. Then she nodded. "Thank you for saying that." Nothing more. No lecture. No emotional speech. No attempt to make him feel worse. The grace of her response somehow made the apology feel even heavier. Daniel laughed softly at himself. "You know, all evening people kept telling me stories about you." Emily smiled. "Hopefully the good ones." All of them were good ones. That made her laugh quietly. The sound carried a familiar warmth that Daniel had not heard in years. For a moment, the distance between past and present felt slightly smaller. Then Emily glanced toward the award folder tucked beneath her arm. "Honestly, most of those stories belong to other people." Daniel shook his head. "That is exactly what everyone said you would say." Emily smiled again. "Then they know me well." The conversation drifted into a comfortable pause. Daniel studied her face. Time had changed both of them. There were new lines around her eyes. More confidence in her posture. A deeper sense of peace than he remembered. Yet the qualities that mattered most seemed unchanged. Kindness, humility, steadiness. He realized those traits had always been there. He simply failed to appreciate them when he had the chance. "You seem happy," he said quietly. Emily looked thoughtful before answering. "I am." The answer arrived without hesitation, without qualification, without explanation. Just simple truth. Daniel nodded. Strangely, hearing that brought him relief rather than sadness. For years he imagined success would be the measure of her life. Standing here now, he understood that happiness had become something far more important. A staff member appeared at the far end of the hallway and informed Emily that transportation was ready whenever she wished to leave. She thanked him politely. Then she turned back toward Daniel. Neither seemed eager to end the conversation, yet both understood the evening was moving forward. And standing beneath the soft lights of the quiet corridor, Daniel realized that the most important revelation of the night was not the award, the applause, or even the recognition. It was discovering that the woman he once underestimated had become exactly the person she always intended to be. Emily Carter glanced toward the far end of the hallway where staff members waited patiently beside the private exit reserved for honored guests. The evening was finally coming to a close. Yet neither she nor Daniel Brooks moved immediately. The conversation between them had opened a door that remained unfinished. For several seconds they stood beneath the soft lighting, surrounded by the distant sounds of a reception gradually disappearing behind them. Daniel looked at the award folder tucked beneath Emily's arm. "You know," he said quietly, "all night I kept thinking the biggest surprise was what you accomplished." Emily listened without speaking. Daniel smiled faintly. "Now I think the bigger surprise is realizing you are exactly the same person you always were." Emily lowered her eyes briefly before looking back at him. "I'm not sure whether that is a compliment." Daniel laughed softly. "It is." The honesty in his voice surprised even him. For years he had measured growth through achievements, titles, and recognition. Emily had clearly grown as well, but not in ways that fit neatly onto a resume. She had become more confident, more experienced, more influential. Yet beneath all of that remained the same woman who once spent hours helping neighbors, listening to strangers, and worrying about people most others overlooked. Daniel suddenly understood why tonight affected him so deeply. The award had not transformed Emily into someone extraordinary. It had simply revealed what had always been there. A group of departing guests passed through the hallway. Several recognized Emily and stopped briefly to congratulate her once more. She thanked each person graciously. One elderly educator shook her hand and said, "You never stopped believing in us." Emily smiled warmly. "Neither did you." The woman laughed and continued toward the exit. Daniel watched the exchange carefully. Even now, after receiving national recognition, Emily instinctively shared credit with others. The pattern never changed. Once the hallway became quiet again, Emily turned toward him. "How have you been, Daniel?" The question caught him off guard. Not because it was difficult, but because it was sincere. After everything that had happened, she was genuinely asking. Daniel considered the answer. "Busy." Emily smiled knowingly. "That sounds like the answer you would have given 10 years ago, too." He laughed. "Probably." The truth was more complicated. His business had succeeded. His reputation remained strong. His calendar stayed full. Yet standing here tonight, those facts felt strangely incomplete. Success had always provided satisfaction, but rarely peace. Looking at Emily, he recognized something he had not expected. Peace. Not because her life had been easy. The stories he heard throughout the evening made it clear she faced countless obstacles. Yet she carried herself with a quiet certainty that seemed immune to public opinion. Daniel found himself asking a question he had not planned to ask. "Were you ever angry?" Emily tilted her head slightly. "About what?" "Everything." The word escaped before he could refine it. "The divorce. The assumptions people made. The things I said." Emily was silent for a moment. Not uncomfortable. Thoughtful. Finally she answered. "For a while, yes." Daniel nodded slowly. The honesty mattered. "But anger is heavy," she continued. "Eventually, I became too busy carrying other things." The sentence settled. Between them. Simple. Direct. Powerful. Daniel looked away briefly. There was wisdom inside that answer he could not ignore. Emily had spent years building communities, supporting families, mentoring students, and helping people recover from hardship. Somewhere along the way, she stopped carrying old resentment because her hands were full of more important responsibilities. The realization humbled him. A staff member approached respectfully. "Ms. Carter, your transportation is ready whenever you are." Emily thanked him. The man nodded and stepped back. The moment neither of them wanted to acknowledge had arrived. The evening was ending. Daniel looked toward the exit doors, then back at Emily. "I am glad I came tonight." Emily smiled softly. "So am I." Her answer surprised him. He searched her expression for sarcasm, but found none. Only kindness. Only sincerity. The same qualities he had witnessed all evening. For the first time since their divorce, Daniel felt the weight of old misunderstandings beginning to loosen. Not disappear entirely. Some mistakes could never be erased, but perhaps they no longer needed to define the future. Emily extended her hand. The gesture was simple, respectful, final. Daniel took it. "Congratulations," he said again, and this time the words carried everything he had been unable to express earlier. Admiration, regret, respect. Emily understood. He could see it in her eyes. "Thank you, Daniel." Then she released his hand and turned toward the exit. Daniel remained standing in the quiet hallway as she walked away beneath the warm lights. He expected to feel loss. Instead, he felt something different. Clarity. Because the woman disappearing through those doors was no longer the person he once underestimated. She was a living reminder that character reveals itself over time. And tonight, after years of believing the wrong story, Daniel had finally met the truth. The private exit doors closed softly behind Emily Carter, and for several seconds Daniel Brooks remained exactly where he was. The hallway felt unusually quiet now. The distant sounds of the reception had faded. Staff members moved discreetly through the building as the event wound toward its conclusion. Yet Daniel did not immediately return to the ballroom. He stood alone beneath the warm lights, reflecting on a conversation that had lasted only a few minutes, but somehow carried the weight of 7 years. Eventually, he walked back toward the reception hall. The room looked different now. Many tables were empty. Decorations remained beautiful, but the energy had changed. The celebration was over. What remained were traces of conversations, memories, and impressions people would carry home with them. Daniel moved slowly past the display panels one final time. Earlier in the evening, he had examined the photographs with curiosity. Now he studied them with understanding. A school renovation, a scholarship ceremony, a community center reopening, a disaster recovery project. Each image represented years of effort hidden behind a single moment. That realization seemed strangely symbolic. Most people only saw the visible result. Very few understood what came before it. The same could be said for Emily. The nation had seen an award. The audience had seen applause. Yet the real story stretched across thousands of ordinary days that nobody documented. Daniel left the ballroom shortly afterward and stepped into the cool Washington night. The air felt crisp against his skin. Government buildings glowed beneath carefully placed lights. Traffic moved steadily through distant streets. The city continued functioning exactly as it had before the ceremony began. Yet something inside him felt different. During the drive back to his hotel, he found himself thinking less about Emily's accomplishments and more about his own assumptions. The uncomfortable truth was impossible to avoid. For years, he had spoken confidently about things he never actually knew. He assumed Emily failed because she was no longer visible inside his world. He assumed silence meant insignificance. He assumed recognition determined value. Tonight had dismantled each of those beliefs one by one. The following morning, news coverage of the ceremony appeared everywhere. Television programs highlighted the award presentation. Newspapers published photographs from the event. Online, articles celebrated community initiatives that had transformed lives across multiple states. Daniel saw Emily's image repeatedly throughout the day. Yet something about the coverage stood out. The stories focused less on her and more on the people she helped. Students receiving scholarships, families rebuilding after disasters, volunteers restoring neighborhoods. Once again, Emily somehow redirected attention away from herself. The pattern continued even after national recognition. Several days passed, then several weeks. Life gradually returned to familiar routines. Meetings, travel, business obligations. Yet the memory of that evening refused to fade. Daniel noticed small changes in himself. He listened more carefully during conversations. He asked more questions before forming conclusions. Most importantly, he became aware of how often people overlooked quiet contributions simply because they lacked publicity. One afternoon, while reviewing a proposal involving community partnerships, he paused longer than usual. In the past, he might have focused exclusively on financial outcomes. This time he found himself asking different questions. Who benefits? How does this improve lives? What impact remains after the headlines disappear? The shift surprised him. Months earlier, he probably would not have considered such things. Around the same time, Emily continued her work exactly as before. The award brought increased visibility, but it did not alter her priorities. Communities still needed support. Students still needed opportunities. Families still needed resources. She returned to those responsibilities with the same quiet dedication she always carried. Several journalists attempted to place her at the center of larger media campaigns. She politely declined many of them. Others she accepted only when they highlighted the organizations and volunteers working beside her. The people who knew her best were not surprised. One autumn afternoon, nearly 6 months after the ceremony, Daniel came across a newspaper feature about a new educational initiative launching in a rural district. Emily's name appeared only once near the end of the article. Most readers might have missed it entirely. Daniel smiled when he saw it. The article felt familiar. Once again, she had invested herself into a project without seeking recognition. Once again, the focus remained on helping others succeed. He folded the newspaper and looked out the office window. Far below, the city moved through another ordinary day. For a long moment, he thought about the difference between achievement and legacy. Achievement often demanded attention. Legacy quietly changed lives whether anyone noticed or not. That distinction had become impossible to ignore. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, the woman he once underestimated continued building that legacy, one community, one family, and one opportunity at a time, proving that the most meaningful victories rarely arrive with applause. They reveal themselves slowly through the lives left better than before. Nearly a year passed after the ceremony in Washington, and the memory of that evening remained surprisingly vivid for everyone who had attended. News cycles moved on. New stories captured public attention. New names appeared in headlines. Yet the impact of what happened that night lingered in quieter ways. Communities continued growing. Scholarship programs expanded. Families found support. Students pursued opportunities that once seemed impossible. The work never stopped because the award had never been the destination. It was only a brief moment along a much longer road. Emily Carter spent that year exactly as she spent the years before it. She traveled to small towns most people overlooked. She sat in school libraries discussing educational initiatives. She listened to community leaders explain local challenges. She attended volunteer meetings where nobody cared about national recognition because there was still work to do. The award remained displayed in a modest office shared with photographs of volunteers, teachers, students, and families. Visitors occasionally asked about it. Emily usually redirected the conversation toward the people in the photographs instead. Some habits never changed. Daniel Brooks noticed those habits from a distance. Their lives remained separate, yet something important had shifted after the ceremony. Not friendship exactly. Not reconciliation in the traditional sense. Something quieter. A mutual respect built on honesty. The need to defend old narratives had disappeared. The need to prove anything had vanished with it. One spring afternoon, Daniel attended a regional leadership conference where several nonprofit organizations presented updates on community development efforts. During a panel discussion, a speaker referenced a program that had dramatically improved graduation rates in underserved districts. Daniel recognized the organization immediately. Emily had helped build it years earlier. The audience applauded the results. Most people in the room never realized whose influence stood behind them. Daniel smiled to himself. A year earlier, he might have considered that unfortunate. Now he understood that anonymity never diminished impact. Sometimes it revealed character. Later that evening, he found himself walking through a city park after the conference concluded. Children played on nearby fields. Families gathered beneath trees. Joggers moved along winding paths. Ordinary scenes unfolded all around him. For reasons he could not fully explain, the memory of Emily's words returned. Anger is heavy. Eventually, I became too busy carrying other things. The sentence had remained with him throughout the year. Not because it sounded poetic. Because it was true. Emily had chosen purpose over resentment. Service over bitterness. Forward movement over old grievances. That choice changed everything. Meanwhile, her work continued creating ripple effects she would probably never fully see. A student who received a scholarship became a teacher. A struggling community center became a gathering place for families. A volunteer inspired others to serve. One act of kindness connected to another, then another. Legacy worked that way, quietly, gradually. often invisibly. One summer morning, a local newspaper published a feature about a young woman who had become the first college graduate in her family. During the interview, she spoke about mentors who believed in her when she doubted herself. She mentioned scholarship programs, community, resources, educational opportunities. Emily's name appeared nowhere in the article, yet her influence existed within every paragraph. That was the remarkable thing about meaningful work. It eventually grew beyond the person who started it. Years later, people remembered the opportunity even when they forgot who created it. And perhaps that was the purest form of success. On a crisp autumn evening, Emily attended the opening of a newly renovated community center in a small town far from any major city. The ceremony was simple. No national media, no famous guests, no speeches from political leaders. Just local families gathering inside a building they desperately needed. Children laughed in the hallways. Volunteers arranged tables. Neighbors greeted one another. Emily stood quietly near the back of the room, watching it all unfold. A young volunteer approached her and asked a question. "How do you know if you are making a difference?" Emily looked around the room before answering. She watched parents talking together, students studying in a new learning space, elderly residents sharing stories over coffee. Then she smiled. "Sometimes you do not." The volunteer looked confused. Emily continued gently. "Sometimes you just keep showing up and trust that kindness travels farther than you can see." The volunteer nodded thoughtfully. The evening continued. Conversations filled the building. Laughter echoed through the halls. Life moved forward. And hundreds of miles away, in cities and towns touched by her work, people continued building better futures because someone believed they were worth the effort. Emily never set out to prove anyone wrong. She never chased revenge. She never spent years waiting for recognition. While others measured success through attention, she measured it through lives changed. In the end, that was why the world eventually stood and applauded. Not because she became famous, not because she received an award from the president, but because she spent years becoming the kind of person who left every place better than she found it. And the man who once called her a failure finally learned a truth that would stay with him forever. The people who change the world are often the same people who never stop caring when nobody is watching.